Tech 216 BC. The plains near Cannae, southeastern Italy. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who had crossed the Alps with elephants and invaded Italy, surveyed the battlefield where his tactical genius had just achieved what military historians would call the perfect battle. Around him lay the bodies of approximately 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers, the largest single-day loss Rome had ever suffered. The Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Paullus was dead. The consul, Gaius Terentius Varro, had fled with perhaps 10,000 survivors from an army that had numbered 80,000 that morning. The Roman military system, built on citizen soldiers and annual conscription, had just lost the equivalent of 8 full-strength legions in a single afternoon. Hannibal's officers urged him to march immediately on Rome. The city lay fewer than 250 miles north, its defenses manned by whatever garrison forces remained after the catastrophic field army losses. Hannibal, Hannibal's cavalry commander, reportedly said, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one. In 5 days you could be dining in the capital." But Hannibal declined. He knew Rome's walls were formidable, that siege operations would be difficult, that his army lacked siege equipment. More fundamentally, he calculated that Rome would now sue for peace. No state could sustain losses like Cannae and continue fighting. The strategic logic was overwhelming. Rome had lost perhaps 20% of its entire military-age male population in a single day. Continuing the war after such a disaster was impossible. What Hannibal couldn't imagine as he looked across the field of Roman dead was that Rome would not surrender. The Republic would not negotiate peace. The Senate would not accept defeat. Instead, Rome would conduct emergency conscription, arming slaves and boys, barely old enough to carry weapons, and field new armies within weeks. When those armies were destroyed, Rome would raise more. When the treasury was empty, wealthy citizens would pay for equipment from personal funds. When manpower seemed exhausted, Rome would conscript criminals and debtors. The strategic calculation that made sense to every military commander in the ancient world, that catastrophic battlefield defeat meant the war was lost, didn't apply to Rome. The mathematics of military persistence were being written not in battlefield victories or tactical genius, but in political will that refused to accept defeat as final, in social institutions that could mobilize resources even after catastrophic losses, in economic reserves that proved deeper than enemies estimated, in demographic capacity that allowed army rebuilding that seemed impossible, and in strategic culture that treated any outcome short of enemy destruction as merely temporary setback. The victory that Hannibal calculated would end the war proved to be merely the beginning of Rome's demonstration that persistence and resource mobilization could overcome tactical brilliance, and that a state willing to pay any price and bear any burden could continue fighting long after rational calculation said the war was lost. The story of how Rome rebuilt its army 3 times after Cannae begins with understanding both the magnitude of the disaster and the specific characteristics of Roman political and social institutions that enabled recovery. The Battle of Cannae on August 2, 216 BC was not just a defeat, it was a catastrophe that should have been decisive. Hannibal had used brilliant tactics, deploying his forces in a crescent formation that baited the Romans into a frontal attack, then enveloped them from both flanks with his cavalry, creating a perfect double envelopment. The Roman army, packed tightly in the center and surrounded on all sides, was systematically annihilated. The casualty figures are difficult to verify precisely because ancient sources often exaggerated, but modern historians generally accept that Roman losses were between 50,000 and 70,000 dead, with perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 captured. From an army of approximately 80,000 infantry and cavalry, fewer than 15,000 escaped. The dead included both consuls, or one consul depending on sources. Lucius Aemilius Paullus was confirmed killed, while Gaius Terentius Varro escaped, though his leadership reputation was destroyed. Also killed were 80 of Rome's senators who had volunteered to serve in the army, 2 quaestors, 29 military tribunes, and numerous equites, the Roman cavalry class drawn from wealthy citizens. The proportion of Roman society's leadership and military-age population killed was staggering. Rome's total citizen population in 216 BC was approximately 270,000 adult males according to census records. Losing 50,000, 70,000 meant roughly 20–25% of the entire military-age male population was killed in a single afternoon. The equivalent proportional loss for the United States today would be approximately 15 to 20 million military-age males killed in one battle. No modern state has experienced anything approaching such catastrophic single-day losses. The strategic situation after Cannae appeared hopeless by conventional assessment. Rome had already lost 2 major battles earlier in the war. The Battle of Trebia in 218 BC, where approximately 20,000 Romans died, and the Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, where another 15,000 died. Combined with Cannae, Rome had lost approximately 85,000, 105,000 soldiers in 3 major battles over 3 years. The cumulative casualties exceeded the total strength of Rome's normal military establishment. Any other ancient state facing such losses would have sued for peace. Furthermore, Hannibal's political strategy was working. After Cannae, numerous Italian allies who had been providing troops and support to Rome defected to Carthage. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to Hannibal. Many cities in southern Italy switched allegiance. Rome's alliance system, which provided much of its military manpower, was fragmenting. Syracuse in Sicily joined Carthage. Philip V of Macedon formed an alliance with Hannibal, opening the possibility of a second front. From any rational assessment, Rome's strategic position was collapsed. The Roman Senate's response to Cannae demonstrated the psychological and institutional foundations that would enable continued resistance. When news of the disaster reached Rome, the city panicked. Citizens flooded the streets. Families mourned their dead. There was discussion of whether to defend the city walls or evacuate, but the Senate refused to accept defeat. Marcus Junius Pera was appointed dictator, the emergency office that concentrated power during crises. Rather than seeking peace terms, the Senate began emergency mobilization. The first decision was unprecedented. The Senate voted to prohibit public mourning beyond 30 days. Rome would not show weakness through prolonged grief. The message was clear. The dead would be honored, but life and warfare would continue. This psychological discipline was crucial to maintaining public morale when most citizens had lost family members or friends at Cannae. The second decision was emergency conscription. Rome lowered the minimum age for military service, conscripting boys aged 17 and even younger in some cases. The property qualification for service was dropped, allowing landless citizens to enlist. Most dramatically, the Senate authorized the recruitment of slaves into the army. Slave owners would be compensated by the state, and slaves who served would receive freedom after the war. This was revolutionary. Roman military tradition held that only citizens should bear arms, that military service was tied to citizenship and property ownership. Necessity overrode tradition. The third decision addressed equipment and finances. Rome's treasury was depleted by 3 years of warfare. Citizens who still possessed wealth were asked to volunteer contributions. The wealthiest citizens paid for entire units' equipment from personal funds. Others contributed whatever they could: armor, weapons, supplies. The response was sufficient that within weeks, Rome was equipping new legions despite the treasury's exhaustion. This demonstrated both the depth of Rome's economic resources and the commitment of the citizen body to continued resistance. Within 6 weeks of Cannae, Rome had fielded new armies. The forces were not of the quality that had been destroyed. Veteran soldiers couldn't be replaced quickly, and many of the new recruits were inexperienced and poorly trained. But they existed, they were armed, and they were ready to fight. To Hannibal's surprise, Rome had not sued for peace. Instead, new Roman armies were deploying to prevent his advance and protect remaining allied cities. The first rebuilt army's composition revealed Rome's mobilization depth. 2 new legions were formed from the survivors of Cannae and previous battles, approximately 10,000 men, who had experience. 2 more legions were formed from the emergency conscription, totaling another 8,000 men. The slave legions added approximately 8,000 more. Additional forces were raised from Latin allies who remained loyal. Within 2 months of the disaster, Rome fielded approximately 40,000 troops in Italy, plus additional forces in other theaters: Sicily, Sardinia, Spain. The strategic doctrine changed fundamentally after Cannae. Quintus Fabius Maximus, who had briefly served as dictator the previous year, had advocated avoiding direct battle with Hannibal and instead pursuing a strategy of attrition, harassment, and delay. This Fabian strategy had been unpopular before Cannae because Romans viewed it as cowardly. After Cannae, it became necessary doctrine. Roman forces would avoid pitched battles, would shadow Hannibal's army to prevent free movement, would attack his foraging parties and supply lines, and would recapture cities that defected. The goal was no longer defeating Hannibal in battle, it was surviving until Hannibal's resources were exhausted. This strategic shift demonstrated Roman adaptability. The traditional Roman approach to warfare emphasized aggressive action, pitched battles, and decisive confrontations. This approach had failed catastrophically against Hannibal's tactical genius. Rather than continuing failed tactics out of tradition or pride, Rome adapted to strategic reality. The Fabian strategy acknowledged that Hannibal was superior in open battle and that Rome's advantage lay in resources, manpower, and strategic patience. The implementation required discipline and political courage. Roman commanders who avoided battle faced public criticism of cowardice. Fabius himself had been mocked as cunctator, the delayer, before Cannae. After Cannae, his caution was recognized as wisdom. The Senate empowered commanders to use discretion in avoiding battle while maintaining pressure on Hannibal. This represented sophisticated strategic thinking that prioritized long-term victory over short-term glory. The second rebuilding came in 215–214 BC when Hannibal destroyed another Roman army and captured several more allied cities. Roman forces attempting to recapture Capua were defeated. Additional cities in southern Italy defected. The military situation remained desperate despite Rome's initial recovery from Cannae. The armies fielded in the immediate aftermath of Cannae had been defeated or significantly depleted through 2 more years of warfare. Rome needed to mobilize again. The Senate conducted another emergency conscription in 215 BC. The minimum age dropped further. Boys aged 16 were now accepted. The property requirements were eliminated entirely. Anyone who could hold a weapon was eligible for service, regardless of social status. More slaves were recruited with promises of freedom. The Latin allies who remained loyal were pressed for additional contributions of troops. The mobilization was less a matter of expanding the army than preventing its complete dissolution. The financial situation was critical. Rome had exhausted most wealthy citizens' willingness to volunteer contributions. The treasury was empty. The Senate took unprecedented economic measures, They reformed the tax system to increase revenues. They imposed forced loans on the wealthy, essentially requiring contributions that would theoretically be repaid after the war. They debased the coinage, reducing the silver content of coins to stretch the available metal. They reduced military pay and supply allocations to minimum levels. Every possible financial resource was squeezed to continue funding the war. The economic measures created hardship throughout Roman society. Inflation increased due to currency debasement. Food supplies became scarce as agriculture was disrupted by warfare. The tax burden fell heavily on those who had already contributed voluntarily. But the society held together because the alternative, defeat and subjugation to Carthage, was considered worse than any privation. The political consensus supporting continued warfare held despite the costs. The second rebuilt army numbered approximately 35,000–40,000 troops in Italy by 214 BC, plus additional forces in other theaters. The quality had declined further. Veteran soldiers were rare, training was minimal, equipment was often substandard. But the army existed and was capable of the Fabian strategy of harassment and attrition. Roman forces could avoid decisive battles, could attack Hannibal's supply lines, could gradually recapture defected cities through siege operations where Hannibal couldn't intervene everywhere simultaneously. The strategic results gradually favored Rome. Hannibal controlled much of southern Italy, but couldn't capture major cities like Rome or force a decisive political conclusion. His army, cut off from Carthaginian reinforcement and resupply, was gradually weakening. The cities that had defected to Carthage were being retaken one by one as Roman forces conducted systematic siege operations. The alliance with Macedonia proved ineffective as Rome fielded separate forces to contain Philip V. The strategic exhaustion worked, slowly, painfully, but measurably. The third rebuilding came in 212–211 BC, when multiple setbacks struck simultaneously. Hannibal captured Tarentum, a major port city in southern Italy. Roman forces besieging Syracuse were initially repulsed. 2 Roman armies in Spain were destroyed, and both commanding generals, the brothers Publius and Gnaeus Scipio, were killed. The total losses in Spain approached 20,000 soldiers. Combined with ongoing attrition in Italy, Rome faced another manpower crisis that required mobilization. The 211 BC conscription was the most desperate yet. Rome was scraping the bottom of its manpower reserves. The minimum age for service dropped to 15 in some cases. Debtors and criminals who would normally be ineligible were recruited with promises of debt forgiveness or pardons. The Latin allies were pressed for contributions beyond what treaties required, causing some to consider defection. The slave legions were expanded further despite the social discomfort of arming such large numbers of slaves. The equipment situation had deteriorated significantly. After 6 years of continuous warfare, Rome's reserves of weapons and armor were depleted. Soldiers were issued whatever could be manufactured quickly or salvaged from battlefields. Quality standards dropped. Armor was thinner, shields were lighter, weapons were simpler. The army being fielded in 211 BC bore little resemblance to the well-equipped legions that had fought at Cannae. But it was an army. It could fight, and it could continue the strategic attrition that was gradually wearing down Hannibal. The financial situation was beyond critical. Rome had exhausted all conventional revenue sources. The Senate took measures that in normal times would have sparked political crisis. They appropriated private property for military use, promising compensation after the war. They requisitioned food from remaining agricultural areas. They essentially imposed a command economy for the duration of the conflict, directing resources to military purposes regardless of private property rights. The measures were legally questionable but politically accepted because the alternative was defeat. The social costs were approaching unbearable levels. Virtually every family in Rome had lost male relatives in the war. Agricultural production had collapsed across large areas as men were conscripted and farms were abandoned or destroyed by warfare. Food shortages were chronic. The standard of living for ordinary Romans had declined dramatically, but political consensus supporting the war held because the Senate maintained unity, because no significant political faction advocated peace, and because the sacrifices were shared relatively equally across social classes. The third rebuilt army numbered approximately 35,000 in Italy by 211 BC, plus forces in other theaters. The total Roman military establishment across all fronts was perhaps 120,000 troops, an extraordinary figure representing sustained mobilization of perhaps 40% of the military-age male population. By comparison, modern states rarely sustain mobilization above 10 to 15% for extended periods. Rome was operating at mobilization levels that would cripple most societies, and had been doing so for 6 years, following catastrophic battlefield losses. But the strategy was working. Hannibal's army in Italy was down to perhaps 30,000 to 35,000 soldiers from the 40,000 he had commanded before Cannae. He controlled shrinking territory as Roman forces methodically recaptured defected cities. His requests to Carthage for reinforcements were mostly ignored, as Carthage prioritized operations in Spain and Sicily. The military stalemate in Italy favored Rome because Rome could sustain mobilization while Hannibal couldn't receive reinforcements. The turning point came with the emergence of Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus, who was elected to command in Spain despite being young and technically unqualified for the position. Scipio studied Hannibal's tactics, adapted Roman military doctrine to counter them, and began winning battles. By 206 BC, Carthaginian forces were expelled from Spain entirely. This victory eliminated the source of resources and reinforcements that Hannibal depended on and gave Rome control of Spain's silver mines, which eased the financial crisis. The strategic initiative shifted definitively to Rome. In 204 BC, Scipio invaded North Africa, threatening Carthage itself. This forced Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy after 15 years of campaigning. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC saw Scipio's reformed Roman army defeat Hannibal decisively. The Second Punic War ended with Carthaginian surrender, payment of massive indemnities, and acceptance of terms that reduced Carthage to a minor regional power under Roman oversight. The institutional factors that enabled Roman persistence deserve detailed examination. First was the political system that maintained unity despite disaster. The Roman Republic's mixed constitution, combining monarchical elements, consuls, aristocratic elements, senate, and democratic elements, assemblies, created checks and balances that prevented any single faction from making peace against the majority will. The Senate controlled foreign policy and maintained consensus supporting continued warfare despite multiple battlefield defeats. Second was the citizenship structure that bound allies to Rome's cause. Roman citizenship had various grades: full citizens, citizens without voting rights, Latin allies, Italian allies. This created graduated tiers of privilege and obligation that made most of Rome's allies feel invested in Roman success. Defection to Carthage meant losing privileged positions in the Roman alliance system. Most allies calculated that remaining loyal to Rome, despite defeats, was better long-term strategy than joining Hannibal. Third was the economic system that provided deeper reserves than apparent. Rome and its allies controlled extensive agricultural territory, silver mines in Spain, trade networks, and diversified economic base. Despite catastrophic military expenses, the underlying economy continued generating revenue. The Senate's willingness to implement extraordinary economic measures, forced loans, property requisitions, currency debasement, meant they could access resources even when conventional means were exhausted. Fourth was demographic capacity. Rome and its Italian allies had combined population of perhaps 3 to 4 million. This base could sustain casualties that would have destroyed smaller states. The continuous conscription over 15 years was possible only because the demographic reservoir was deep enough to absorb catastrophic losses and continue providing soldiers. Fifth was military flexibility and learning. Rome adapted tactics after recognizing Hannibal's superiority in pitched battle. Roman commanders studied Hannibal's methods and developed counters. The Roman military system was capable of evolution, incorporating new tactics, modifying organization, learning from defeats. This adaptability was institutional rather than depending on individual genius. Sixth was strategic culture that refused to accept defeat as permanent. Roman political culture viewed warfare as existential contest rather than limited conflict. The concept of negotiated settlement after battlefield defeat was incomprehensible when Roman security was at stake. This total war mentality meant Rome would continue fighting regardless of costs until enemy was defeated or Rome was physically destroyed. The Carthaginian failure to anticipate Roman persistence stemmed from misunderstanding these factors. Hannibal and Carthaginian leadership calculated based on rational assessment that catastrophic battlefield defeat meant political defeat. This calculation was correct for most ancient states. Losing 50,000 plus soldiers in a single battle would force any normal state to sue for peace. But Rome wasn't a normal state. Its political, social, and economic institutions were structured in ways that enabled sustained mobilization after losses that would have destroyed other powers. Hannibal's tactical genius, which was genuine and would influence military thinking for millennia, couldn't compensate for the strategic reality that he faced an opponent whose resource base and political will exceeded his own. Carthage couldn't or wouldn't match Roman mobilization intensity. Carthage sent limited reinforcements while Rome conscripted its entire military-age population. Carthage prioritized preserving resources while Rome spent everything necessary. Carthage saw the war as one conflict among many, while Rome treated it as existential struggle. The longer-term implications of Rome's persistence in the Second Punic War were profound. First, the war established Rome as the dominant Mediterranean power. Carthage was broken as a rival. The other Hellenistic kingdoms recognized that Rome's military power, sustained by its institutional capacity for mobilization, made opposing Rome extremely dangerous. Rome's reputation for never accepting defeat became a strategic asset. Enemies understood that fighting Rome meant fighting until absolute exhaustion because Rome wouldn't quit. Second, the war validated Roman military and political institutions. The mixed constitution, the alliance system, the citizen-soldier model, the Senate's foreign policy control, all these had been tested by catastrophic defeat and had survived. This institutional confidence would underpin Roman expansion for the next 2 centuries. Rome knew its system worked because it had survived the ultimate test. Third, the war demonstrated that resource mobilization and strategic persistence could overcome tactical brilliance. Hannibal was perhaps the greatest tactical commander in ancient history, but he lost because Carthage couldn't match Rome's strategic stamina. This lesson influenced Roman strategy thereafter. Rome would win through sustained pressure, resource superiority, and refusal to accept battlefield defeat as decisive. Fourth, the war shaped Roman strategic culture for generations. The willingness to pay any cost, to continue despite setbacks, to mobilize total societal resources. These became defining characteristics of Roman warfare. Future conflicts would see Rome repeatedly absorbing initial defeats, then mobilizing superior resources to grind down opponents. This pattern appeared against Pyrrhus, against Macedon, against Germanic tribes, and in civil wars. The human costs of Roman persistence were staggering and shouldn't be minimized. The casualty figures are difficult to establish precisely, but conservative estimates suggest Rome lost 150,000 to 200,000 military-age males killed over the 15 years of the Second Punic War. This represented perhaps 50 to 60% of the pre-war military-age male population. The demographic impact lasted generations. Rome had to absorb tens of thousands of non-citizens into citizenship to rebuild population levels. The economic costs were equally severe. Agriculture across Italy was devastated by 15 years of warfare. Food production didn't return to pre-war levels for decades. The public debt incurred during the war took generations to repay. The currency debasement caused inflation that persisted for years. The standard of living declined significantly and took a generation to recover. The social costs included the disruption of traditional norms, slaves serving in military units, property rights being overridden by state requisitions, women entering economic roles previously reserved for men because male labor was conscripted. These changes, necessary during crisis, had permanent effects on Roman society. The society that emerged from the Second Punic War was different from what existed before, shaped by the total mobilization the war required. Yet Rome survived and prevailed. The persistence that Carthage never expected proved decisive. The armies that were rebuilt after Cannae, rebuilt again after subsequent defeats, and rebuilt yet again when manpower seemed exhausted, eventually wore down Hannibal through attrition, despite his tactical superiority. The financial measures that seemed desperate somehow kept functioning. The political consensus that should have fractured under the strain held together. The society that should have collapsed under the burdens continued mobilizing. The mathematics weren't written in battlefield victories or tactical brilliance. They were written in institutional capacity for mobilization that exceeded enemy estimates, in political systems that maintained unity despite catastrophe, in demographic depth that could absorb casualties no normal state could sustain, in economic reserves that proved deeper than apparent, and in strategic culture that simply refused to accept defeat regardless of costs. The persistence that Carthage dismissed as irrational proved to be the decisive strategic factor, not the brilliance of Hannibal's tactics at Cannae, but the determination of Rome to rebuild its army 3 times afterward and continue fighting until Carthage was exhausted. The victory at Cannae that should have ended the war merely demonstrated that battlefield victory wasn't sufficient against an opponent whose persistence exceeded rational calculation, whose institutions enabled mobilization that seemed impossible, and whose strategic culture treated any outcome short of enemy destruction as merely temporary setback, requiring renewed effort rather than permanent defeat, requiring acceptance. Carthage learned too late that Rome's greatest weapon wasn't tactical skill or battlefield valor, but the stubborn, exhausting, relentless persistence that would continue mobilizing, continue fighting, continue paying any cost, until the enemy simply couldn't continue. A strategic characteristic that would define Roman military power for centuries, and that no enemy would ever fully counter.